Okay, without further ado, thank you everyone for joining this latest Value in Energy Data series. My name is Jake Verma. I'm a senior consultant at the Energy Systems Catapult. Can I please remind everyone for the duration of this session to please put yourselves on mute and switch your cameras off. That's so that we can present the content and we can see Robbie's face at all times. Recording and transcription have started. You can see at the top there's the privacy policy. If you have any issue with this, then please drop me a message. Also, for the duration of the session, please feel free, as Tabitha has said, if you have questions, then please pop them in the chat window on the right-hand side, and we will come through. We will get through as many of them as possible once Robbie has completed his presentation. So I'm only going to do a short introduction to Robbie. So Robbie, thank you so much for joining us today. It's much appreciated. So Robbie has, we've had quite a bit of interaction with Robbie over the last couple of years whilst we've been developing internally through ESC, the Energy Data Task Force, Digitalisation Task Force, Energy Data Best Practice, and a number of other initiatives. Robbie's an engineer from New Zealand, he's now living in Berlin. He works on high resolution energy systems models. And he's been, I think, quite a few people know him as an extremely high profile member of the OpenMod community, constantly pushing the energy data community to do better. And I think that's part of what you're going to be talking about today. So I think I can speak on behalf of the OpenMod community that when I say I think we've got a fantastic advocate in Robbie, and your dedication to helping get energy data to fight climate change is pretty inspirational, which is great. Which is why we're also very glad to have you here talking to us today. So without further ado and without any more delay from me, Robbie, I'll hand over to you. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed this webinar.
Okay, great. If I can have the slides up. I guess one of the things that is interesting is that I interact with open source lawyers through the Free Software Foundation Europe legal network mailing list and community, and I pick up quite a lot of my ideas and have them challenged also in that context. So next slide. And we don't, next one. Okay, I went down to the first Fridays for Future school strike in Berlin and interviewed Luisa Neubauer. And this is a shot that I took. I'd like to kind of reinforce that our generation, my generation in particular, has left this planet in a terrible state. And I just wanted to acknowledge that. So next. Some background, I think we can skip that. Okay, what I want to talk about is the legal aspects of open data, and it's mostly in the context of European Union law, because I felt that was probably the most, where most of the audience would be from. The US is a bit different and quite a lot laxer. And with respect to European Union law, most of those directives were written into United Kingdom statutes and therefore continue to apply post-Brexit until they're revisited by the UK Parliament. When I talk about software and code, I'm just talking about basically energy system models. And when I'm talking about data, I mean non-personal open data, which can be or has been made legitimately public. That's to take some issues off the table I'll cover next. So next. Yeah, the two issues to take off the table are personally identifiable information and trade secrets. And they're both protected under their own separate legislation. As you probably realize, there's a data tsunami at the moment, enabled by, of course, advances in hardware and internet technologies. But I want to reinforce that the interest in openness, that's data that's freely usable and reusable, is driven equally by transparency and opportunity. Now, I'm going to concentrate on the transparency side for this presentation. Next. Just a short context, open science is getting more airplay these days, and this is a diagram from UNESCO, and I just put the grey block over the bits that we inhabit, which are open source software and open data primarily. Next. Unlike other areas of science, energy system analysis is highly reliant on what the European Commission describes as privately held information of public interest. So it's difficult for us to go and collect information about, of glaciers or in the oceans or wherever. Some of this information comes in through statutory reporting, and I'll revisit this later, but two pieces of statutory reporting without open licensing are the ENSO e-transparency platform and mandated public disclosures by the EEX, the electricity exchange for covering Europe. Next. I'm going to digress. This is a sales pitch. The OpenMod. Formed 7 years ago in Berlin, Germany. I wasn't there. I joined about 18 months later. It produced a manifesto, but one of the interesting things is that Berlin open source lawyer Till Jaeger spoke at that first meeting, so that open has been front and center for the OpenMod from its very inception. It's hard to put a number on its membership, but somewhere between 200 and 900. Next, please. All good movements have a manifesto, and the OpenMod was not was there too. So this is a diagram from the very first meeting showing the processing chain, looking for open data and looking for open source models. Next. Okay, I've got about 6 or 7 slides on core legal concepts because I think it's worth running through these. The first concept that applies to data is copyright. But for a work to attract copyright, it has to be sufficiently creative, substantial, and human-derived. And I have a little shot of the so-called monkey selfie, where the monkey took a picture of itself, and this was determined at court to be public domain, that neither the person who set up the camera nor the monkey would hold copyright. The United Kingdom utilizes an uncharacteristically low efforts-based so-called sweat of the brow threshold for copyright. Most other jurisdictions have some level of creativity that's required. The other main bit of legislation that affects us is the database Directive 96/9 EC, which is part of European Union law and also currently part of United Kingdom law. There are doctrines like fair use and fair dealing in countries with common law heritages, and countries in continental Europe with a civil law heritage are more likely to list exceptions more explicitly. There is nowhere is there satisfactory legislative support for open data, and the same actually goes for open source software, that the licenses and all the practices and so forth that surround both data and code have been developed outside of a legislative framework. Next. So this is the database directive, which I'll come back to repeatedly. I've written up there a complete blight for open energy system analysis because it was designed to protect databases and it's very broad. And when energy system analysts come to obtain material from an internet database, they don't know whether the database protection applies and whether their extraction, to use the technical term, is substantial and therefore protected and not lawful. For some reason I can't explain, there was no statutory limitation for public sector information, nor for information under statutory reporting. And the directive is intended to support the database industry within Europe, and I think it has failed on that level. There is no such protection in the US, for example. Next. So just a run through on the legislative landscape. So there's the copyright directive, there's the database directive I just mentioned, there's the open data directive, which covers public sector information, and there are two pieces of legislation that will apply solely to Europe in play, the Proposed Data Act and the Proposed Data Governance Act. The OpenMod put in two submissions, well, when people within the OpenMod put in two submissions on the Data Act. It is intended to deal with the question of privately held information of public interest, so-called B to G flows, business to government flows, so that government could, policymakers and so forth could have better access to the information they need. Next. Next, please. I just want to point out some jurisdictional differences. I've kind of mentioned them already. In the United Kingdom, these issues are governed solely by intellectual property law. There is no sense of a contract because you need a consideration to form a contract under English law. Other countries, it's not the case. In Germany, for example, a public license is clearly covered by contract law, and there's a case in France at the moment to do with the GPL software license that's being prosecuted under contract law. I think that's all I need to say on that. So next. Another issue which energy system data can get tangled up into, but I know of no examples, and this is distinct from the database directive, is the concept of compilations, which are collections of other works. And if that compilation is sufficiently skilled and creative in its selection and arrangement, then the compilation in itself will hold copyright. I'm not familiar with, as I said, with this applying, but it's also something that putting open licenses on data sets will automatically exclude. Next. So we come to the concept of public licensing, of which open licensing is a subset. A public license is something that the originator of the material who holds the intellectual property rights puts on a particular work, say a data set, and signals the conditions under which use and reuse are allowed. And there is no contact necessarily between the holder of the copyright who issued the public license and the users downstream. As I said, in the UK, this is not a contract because you would need some contact between the originator and the user for a contract to form, but not so in countries like France and Germany. Normally a failure to comply with a license will result in that license being summarily revoked. And then conversely, if there is no intellectual property contained in that material, then that license notice can be legitimately ignored, and the information can be treated, or the work can be treated as public domain or equivalent to public domain. I think that's all I need to say on that. Next. Choice of law is actually an important concept in terms of data provision, because it's the location of the server that determines a choice of law in the first instance, given that the license is silent on that point. And licenses have tended to become international. all the current Creative Commons licenses are international. They do not specify a jurisdiction, and so that people are free to fight, to litigate under whichever national law they choose. But normally the location of the server is material. Next. So that's an overview. I'm going to run through a series of points, and they're a little bit ad hoc, a little bit eclectic, but it's kind of how it is. I'm not going to talk to this slide beyond to point out that the database protection is being wound back under a series of ad hoc court rulings when it comes to public sector information, and you can read about some of those decisions there. This is also puts pressure on things like the NSOE transparency platform to actually open license, because they're unlikely to get support if push comes to shove and the case ends up in the European Court of Justice. Next. I just put the slide in for the US because to point out that the US has very little intellectual property protection for databases. It has no database right, and the compilation issue that I mentioned earlier is also unlikely to apply. So this is advice from the US Copyright Office in 2017. So almost all this kind of information that we're talking about is unencumbered in the United States. Next. I mentioned the proposed EU Data Act, and it's due to report its next iteration in about a month's time. And the database directive is under scrutiny, so that will be very interesting to see if someone bites the bullet and at least provides, reduces its coverage on statutory reporting. Next. You can't read this, I know, but have a look on the slides if you wish. It's the German copyright definitions presented as a UML class diagram, and it's actually quite interesting to see how the definitions are organized. Next. I want to talk about the fact that open data licenses in the majority of cases do not provide permission to utilize. They merely provide legal certainty that litigation will not arise. And one of my legal friends tells me that being right is not enough, staying out of court is also important. So this general idea, if you like, falls under the tragedy of the anti-commons with respect to energy sector data. And I think there are some very good public interest reasons for tackling this much more rigorously, you know, at the national and European parliaments level. Next. Here's a definition for open data, and I think it's quite useful and it's quite well worth repeating. But open data as a concept is generally understood to denote data in an open format that can be freely used, reused, and shared by anyone for any purpose. And that comes out of the Open Data Directive of about 3 years ago. Next. There are a whole lot of unresolved issues, and I listed some here, but most of them are definitional. And I've kind of hinted on most of them so far. So I'll skip over. The application of an open data license will normally resolve most of these issues, but it would be better if they were also dealt with legislatively. Next. So licenses come under a typology, and we talked about public licenses near the beginning, and then we want open licenses and then open data licenses that meet the definition that I've just quoted from the Open Data Directive. Next. One of the questions which is not resolved and is very difficult to resolve, even under the licensing terms, is what constitutes joint authorship. And the open source community have generally held that each contributor retains copyright to the individual identifiable contributions, but that's not necessarily the case. And here is an alternative view, arguing that that would not stand up in court. And it's also not the best way of dealing with joint authorship. Next. Again, a complex slide, and you can look at it at your leisure, but I'm trying to indicate that the boundary between code and data is quite blurry in practice. So although there's a software directive and there is legislation about data and so forth, and in practice, it's actually often quite hard to make that separation. Next. A slide about the SPDX identifiers. These are the ones that you can see below. They'll be reasonably familiar, but there are about 17,000 of them databased. And you can look through the database if you need to. But the most common one for data is CC BY 4.0 for the primary data, followed with CC 0 1.0 for the metadata. Next. Which brings me onto this slide. These are my data license picks. They align with what other people are talking about, but I can't say that there is a complete consensus in the OpenMod community. But I did notice that Ofgem was settling on CC BY 4.0 in a recent consultation document they had released. Next. I just want to talk about FAIR data principles, because FAIR gets quite a lot of airplay, and the principles are fine. So don't treat this slide as a criticism, more as a comment, but the R in reusable does not mean globally reusable. And specifically R 1.1 just requires that the data and metadata are released with a clear and accessible data usage license. So fair and open in some respects are orthogonal, and that brings up the concept of a FAIR O acronym, in which the material is also open licensed. Next. Legal metadata for data introduces another raft of challenges. The Dublin Core is probably a good place to start. It was developed by librarians quite some time ago for cataloging primarily literary works, but it ports into data quite well, I think. There are also other issues to do with provenance, so versioning, license compliance and tracking, and so forth. The open software world has been working hard on these issues for a very long time, because, as you know, an operating system will be, a huge bundle of different packages and files and so forth, and they all have to be checked for compliance now. So there are methods for doing that. I won't digress. Next. So here's the Dublin Core. It nominates a creator, writes about the rights held in and over the resource, and then various other entities. And the Open Knowledge Foundation are also supplying support for some of these Dublin Core fields through their frictionless data concept. Next. Okay, I'm going to dwell on this slide for a little, because I think it's quite instructive. The ENSOE transparency platform is not open licensed, and there has been long-standing dialogue between members of the OpenMod and ENSOE, and the matter is still not resolved. For some reason, the enabling legislation for the transparency platform talked about a primary data owner without specifying any legal context for that statement. So that idea sort of filters back up through the the chain. And when we deal with ENSOE, we are told that all their members have to agree to a license. I'm not sure that's true, but that's the situation we're in. Just as a side comment too, the Bundesnetzagentur, the regulator in Germany, extracts information from the transparency platform and puts it out under a CC BY 4.0 license on the basis of a legal opinion they have. So the German regulator, network regulator, is satisfied that that's acceptable practice, but we can't talk ENSOE into changing their practice. The second one is mandatory disclosure by the EEX, the European Energy Exchange, and they put their information out on web-based reporting, but they disable it, probably using CCS or JavaScript, and prevent it from being highlighted and copied. And recently we complained, members of the OpenMod complained to the ACER, the regulator, and the ACER say that the current practice is compliant. Now, these are important sources of numerical information for energy system analysts, and the state of affairs is frankly really substandard. Next. So I just want to pull out some legal conclusions, I guess. I think the choice of license is sufficiently well resolved in my view, and I mentioned CC BY 4.0 for primary data and CC0 1.0 for metadata. Interoperability with other licenses needs analysis, including the OGL UK 3.0, which is a very weak license used by the UK government. I'm not saying that it's not inbound compatible with the CC BY 4.0. I would just like to see some detailed legal analysis. We definitely need tooling to handle legal metadata and information provenance to a much better degree. And we need open data standards, and I'll come back to that later. But we may need public funding to buy out some of the copyrights, and that could be a useful and legitimate thing to do. Next. I guess some of you who have been following the OpenMod will have seen that 50-odd researchers from the OpenMod wrote an open letter to the International Energy Agency, pushing them to add open licenses on the data that they collect from normally from national governments. And we were very fortunate that the Guardian ran a story on that particular open letter on the 10th of December. And subsequently, the IEA director and board endorsed a policy shift toward open data. That policy shift has yet to be endorsed by the IEA member countries, but that's coming up on the 2nd of February. So there's some links here if you need to look in the background. Next. So as I mentioned, there's an upcoming ministerial meeting. I highlighted 4 licensing and revenue models that the IEA has used or is considering. But the one that they were experimenting before our open letter was a dual model with this CC BY NC SA 3.0 IGO license. And it is the most bizarre license choice I can imagine. It's not data capable because 4.0 was the first to traverse the database rights. Defining the non-commercial boundary is highly problematic, as the open source software community has found. And pushing your data into copyleft will just create a license-bound data silo, because once it goes to SA, it can't come back into non-SA. I can't imagine why they chose that license, unless they wanted to make their open or their public information is unusable as they possibly could muster. Next. I just got 2 slides at the end, and then we can go into questions. But I'd like to flag the issue of legally encumbered data standards and the IET Common Information Model for electricity systems, which covers things like assets like substations and transmission lines and so forth, is proprietary. And I would argue it's hindering its wider uptake. Ofgem looked at it, but didn't bite. LF Energy, who are looking at getting into the smart grid space, would also use it, but again, it's proprietary. And so what once worked for industry no longer works for public interest analysis and in other contexts today. So I would argue this kind of model that the IEA also demonstrates, where they generated revenue by selling legally encumbered products. In the IEA's case, they were data products. In the IET case, they were data standards. I'm kind of speculating that fair use might apply, but again, you know, that's the legal risk, and it would be much better to have this dealt with at the legislative level. Next. And just the final slide on community resolution. You know, this is a consensus exercise. Semantics, technical formats, licensing, community curation, governance, architecture, and so forth. So I'm just saying that there's a lot of work in the background and a lot of goodwill, and these are very complicated issues, and I'll do my best to contribute where I can. So I think that's it. Next.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Robbie. Really, really interesting to hear some of those thoughts. There haven't been many questions in the chat box, but I have a couple of questions just to get people started. So if you do have a question for Robbie or something has provoked a question, then please pop it in the chat window and I will ask it directly. So I guess I kept thinking as I was listening to your presentation about so many of these sort of legal regimes derive from literary work and from a sort of previous, I guess you could say, outdated concept of what information or data is versus what you would have copyrighted in historical terms. Does this perhaps suggest, in your opinion, that there needs to be a completely different, you know, regime of information sort of legal frameworks, or are the existing ones sufficient to port over to things like energy data for the purposes of tackling climate change?
Yeah, I mean, you're right, and software classes as literary work under law. And so your code poetry and my code poetry sort of have...
I wouldn't say my code is poetry, for sure.
But sure, that's a really interesting question. Do we want to kind of rewrite a big chunk of intellectual property law, you know, suitable for the 21st century, particularly around data? And or do we want to try and patch what we have? My feeling is actually for the public data we're talking about, that patching it is okay. But when you start talking about personally identifiable information flowing through smart systems, then you are in a different league. And just a comment, I keep a little in contact with the Icebreaker One, and they had previously had some experience developing open banking, and then moved into open energy. And we're going to be developing a trusted brokerage system where people could nominate their terms and conditions and kind of interact algorithmically, let's say. But they've moved back out into the open data space, the public data space, because it's just very difficult to deal with the issues, including the legal issues associated with doing some kind of automated brokerage.
And certainly, do you feel that, I mean, this might be a bit of a loaded question, given that I've had quite a bit of experience with this, but do you think there's additional sort of legal knowledge that some of the energy entities need in order to pass through some of these issues about data sharing?
Yeah, I think there's been a reluctance to grasp the legal issues. But I also had an email from a legal friend of mine yesterday that talked about the fact that community organizations are under-lawyered, and sophisticated commercial entities are, if you like, over-lawyered. And he was talking about the fact that in some senses, and this is a little debatable, but a license is a social contract as much as it is a legal arrangement.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it, actually. Yeah. So on the, I'm gonna, in fact, I have a couple more questions, but I'm gonna go to the chat window because a couple of them have been coming through. So Steve Hayburn has said many organisations have released their data via CC BY 4.0 licenses, but then made access to the data chargeable. I'm thinking ECMWF weather data as one example. Is this common, or is this compatible with openness, and what are your thoughts on this? And the reason why we've encountered this is because we were wondering if it was licensed under CC BY, but we had to pay for it. We could just ask somebody else to send us the data that we needed, who had already purchased it, and that would technically be okay. So that seems a little confusing.
I'm not sure why they do that, but once it has a CC BY 4.0 license on it and you have it, then you are pretty free to do what you like with it, as long as you acknowledge the source. And I'll give an example along those lines too. Some of the information on the ENSO transparency platform, which is not licensed, ends up on the World Resources Institute server in the US. And there was some discussion between the two organizations. And the kind of, I don't know if you call it a conclusion, but the sort of resolution, if you like, was that European law does not apply to US servers, and that what the World Resources was doing was fine. So yeah, my caveat earlier about staying out of court, of course, is there. But you know, I was sort of pointing out the IEA were toying with a dual licensing model for non-commercial, and the German economics ministry just supported that position. And I pointed out that there's nothing really to stop someone, a US NGO, from setting up a server there and obtaining that information and putting it out under CC0, for example. It's not a problem under US law. And would they get litigated under French law? I don't think so.
So, I mean, this was going to be my follow-up question. Was, you know, you mentioned about commercial entities being over-lawyered and community entities being under-lawyered, and I noticed on one of your slides that said, you know, do we perhaps need to test some of this in the European court or one of the courts? And one of the things that I was thinking was we've investigated a couple of times using environmental information regulations in the UK to request something that, you know, perhaps doesn't sit under what you would consider environment, but definitely with climate change being so heavy in the public consciousness that you could argue that a lot of the information around and data around energy is then, perhaps covered, and maybe that needs to be tested in court.
Yeah, I mean, you have public disclosure.
Yeah.
And freedom of information requests. Is that what it's called in the UK?
Yes, the freedom of, but there's a separate one called environmental information regulations, which is designed to force people like polluters to tell you how much that they are, offloading into rivers and that kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's kind of freedom of information, but for environment.
Yeah. I mean, you end up with the dilemma in the end about what is the legal status of that information. You may get hold of it and you may be able to use it, which you can say, for example, from the transparency platform, but can you combine it with other data and license it CC BY 4.0 sure. And so forth. Yeah. So the whole ecosystem is really what is, in the background here.
Yeah. So I've got a question from Pang Yue Xing. Says, fantastic presentation and a lot of detail. Could you please expand on the downsides of OGL?
Okay. Look, I'm going to practice law without a license here. I noticed that the OGL elected UK law, of course, as a choice of law, and the CC BY license is international and doesn't admit further restrictions. And so I pointed out to a lawyer friend and another friend that this could be a conflict, and I was told probably not. So that was my concern, and what I think is irrelevant, but I would like to see this kind of analysis undertaken on a substantial basis. And one of the submissions on the Data Act to the European Commission was a request to do a proper across-the-board analysis of license compatibilities.
Okay. So Stacey Brentnell says, where public interest cases require personal data, what would the legal context for open data be? And the example she gives is MPANs, which I know we've talked about before, and consumption data, which is classed as personal data under an ICO ruling. But obviously, this data is required for things like system stability and security in a low or zero inertia system. So there's a public interest use case there as well. What are your thoughts on the kind of public interest cases and how that might be expanded, not just in the UK, but internationally?
Yeah, I mean, my first reaction was that that information has a public interest, but whether it needs to be public is really the question.
Yeah.
And just to step back a little, smart grids concepts will look at that use case and magnify them orders of magnitude. So yeah, this is uncharted territory, but I am sensitive to the protection of personally identifiable information. And for energy system modelers, if that's anonymized sufficiently, that's okay. We just need typical households. We don't need actual households. But if you're running the system, you will need actual households.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sam, who's our data science practice manager, asks, where do trained AI models, i.e. not just the code that generates them or the general algorithm, but the neural network, including its weights, sit in relation to data and software when it comes to IP and licensing?
Now that's a can of worms.
Well, you've got 14 minutes left, Robbie. So
look, the AI thing is you talked about needing legislation for the 21st century. This is a clear case. There are all sorts of issues. Can you train AI on copyrighted information? What's the consequence? Can AI generated patents be registered? The answer is not in many jurisdictions, and so on and so on. So yes, that's a can of worms I'm going to duck.
Right. Okay. Maybe we'll put Sam and you in touch to discuss this in more detail. Yeah. So David Phillips asks, interested to hear your comments about sector caution. Do you feel there are distinct ideological positions at play around trust? And does this need a vehicle for more meeting of minds?
That's sort of interesting. I mean, I'll interpret that by saying, you know, what kind of relationship have the OpenMod community established with, you know, other key players out there? I think we're usually pretty considerate and well behaved, and so I'm not sure in our case that lack of trust is such an issue. I mean, I have a cordial relationship with the NSOE legal department. So I think the issues are kind of more that the institutions involved just really don't know how to deal with them, rather than those on the outside pushing have been, you know, badly behaved.
Yeah, I think I agree with that as well. And I guess there's, so a follow-up thing is Judith Ward, who worked on the Smart Meter Public Interest Advisory Group, has just put in a link to their excellent PIAG paper, which was published last year, which is definitely a good, if anybody's interested in the public interest case for smart meter data, that's the primary place to go to. So on the topic of kind of caution from these institutions, what do you think? What do you think are the factors that lead them to be cautious? Is it about litigation that they're concerned about, or is it something else?
I think the world is changing, you know, and that's difficult. There are some people, EDF in France, the transmission system operator, is very keen on open data, and they're our poster boy, if you like, within the industry.
Yeah.
I think another thing that needs to be kind of stressed is that not much of this is going to come back and be problematic, I don't believe. And the advantages are wide. Now, I go into bat for the public interest, but there are also lots of opportunities out there, you know, for commercial projects and so forth.
And do you think that they're quite, I mean, they are quite conservative when it comes to things like, I mean, the argument that I've heard when doing open data triages is that on a commercial interest basis, they can often feel like they're giving away value, even if they haven't recognized what the value of that information is themselves. How would you start to go about describing or pushing back on some of those concerns, I suppose?
Well, I would respond by saying that, you know, if this information is in the commons and it has community curation, then they will benefit more than they lose, if you like.
Yeah.
But talking about institutions, the IEA, and this is just via elite email, no one has got firsthand evidence, but this, it seems very reliable. Fatih Birol, the executive director, and the board have just opted for open data as a policy and want their member countries to endorse that. So they jumped. I have no idea what went on, and we were all very surprised yeah.
Well, hopefully we'll see some of that coming out over the next couple of months. I have to say I was quite surprised when I saw that they were considering making some of that data, pleasantly surprised that they were considering making some of that data more accessible. I'm not sure of their business model around that, but
yeah, I just fill you in a little. There's a philanthropist in the wings. I have no idea what their identity is, whether they have a stake, who are negotiating because their revenue shortfall would be about 6 million US per annum. But I just want to, so we're talking about the IEA, there's also an international dimension. The open energy modeling community has started working in Africa in particular. That's Pipes and Meets Africa, that's Euphoria, Onset, and so on. And they need the IEA data, there's no question about that. And so the present arrangement is actually really detrimental for the Global South.
Yeah. It's a similar thing to what you sometimes get in commercial settings, where you give someone the data and then they charge you to get hold of your own data, isn't it?
I actually went further than that. You said I was from New Zealand. I wrote to the New Zealand Minister of Energy, and I said this could be interpreted as neocolonialism, actually.
Yeah.
Sourcing it from Global South countries and then selling it back to their researchers.
Yeah.
And is that something we really want to do in this this context?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. If there are no more questions in the chat, I'm going to say thank you so much, Robbie, for joining us today. We really appreciate your insight. And if you could just pop your details, I think we'll send out the details via email to the participants if you're happy to have your email address. And I would encourage everybody on this call to go and join the OpenMod community and see all of the lively discussion that's going on there around data access and licensing. I suspect you'll see Robbie's name frequently popping up there as one of the key contributors. But thank you so much, Robbie, for joining us today.
Can I ask a question then in reverse?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We actually don't have much reach into the UK. We're sort of ground zero is Germany with Denmark and Sweden and increasingly the US, but we don't have much reach into the UK. Can you speculate on why?
I don't know, but I'm going to make it my personal mission to try to get as many people as possible into the OpenMod community from the UK now. So I'm going to take that on as a task. And I can see a couple of go-getters on this call, like Dave Phillips might be interested in joining up. So we'll start promoting it. I promise to start promoting it from an ESC perspective as well. There you go. That's my promise to you.
Thank you. Just to answer your question, please circulate my personally identifiable information. I'll be putting the slides up on Zenodo.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Robbie. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll speak to you soon.
Yeah, and look, we came in on time.
We did, yeah, that's good.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.